Hi, everybody. So for chapter 15 and 16, we are going to read about some really interesting changes that happened to Mr. Matthew Carlton and his friends. So during this, I want you definitely to be thinking about their personality traits and them as a character as I go through, and then you'll be able to do the questions for me. Chapter 15. There, son, Mr. Hornby had taken the bull from Matt. You're too young to be having to make sense of this war business, though in truth, even as an old man such as myself can little understand it. For you are a patriot, right? Matt asked. Nathan Hornby. I'll not have this talk in my house. It's too dangerous. Mrs. Hornby interrupted. Her husband sighed heavily, motioning for Matt to try the stew. Temperance makes a fine stew, he smiled weakly, but a dreadful patriot, I'm afraid. Matt tasted the stew and tried to smile. It's not that she's a Tory, really, Mr. Hornby whispered. A Tory is like another name for someone that's loyal to the crown. As his wife went back to her loom, it's just that she's afraid. I wouldn't sign for the king's protection papers, as many as my neighbors have. The means of our farm is open game for plundering by the British regulars and the Hessians alike, especially if it be known that we were harboring a rebel. So remember, plundering means to go through someone's home. Later, when we learn about different laws that are made during the Bill of Rights, you'll see why some of them are made, and we'll be referencing that. And harboring a rebel, he looked down at his gnarled hands and shook his head. I'm an old man. I've worked my whole life for this farm. I've lost most of my fencing to this war. Why, they even cut down 2 of my apple trees for firewood. My heart is with our American boys, he whispered, but in truth, we're too old to be part of the struggle, and you see what we can't offer you shelter here, or it would be too dangerous. He lifted his weary eyes to Matt. I understand, Matt told him, finishing up the bowl of stew. I have to get back across the river anyway. My sister and friends are probably worried about me. And what is your family's name? Mr. Hornby asked. Carlton, Matt mumbled. My name is Matthew Carlton. So in Pennsylvania you come from, Matthew Carlton? Sorry, Mr. Hornby smiled. Forsooth, I've never seen such dress across the river, he said, nodding in the directions of Matt's sweatshirt and jeans, which are hanging on a drying rack behind him. Tell me, what's this contraption on your breeches called? He asked, pointing to the zipper. And these stitchings, I've never seen such fine little stitches. Was it your sister who made them for you? Remember, they didn't have sewing machines or anything to make clothing that nicely. You could see that Mrs. Hornby had put down her shuttle and was waiting with raised eyebrows for Matt to reply. No, my sister didn't make them, Matt tried to explain. My mother bought. Oh, it was your mother then, Mr. Hornby interrupted. She's a skilled seamstress, he marveled, fingering the top stitching of Matt's jeans. No, you don't, Matt began. And her shoe, Matthew, Mr. Hornby exclaimed, picking up the red sneaker. Who made your shoe? And what animal skin is this from? As he asked, taking a bite on the rubber sole. Matt looked into the kindly old man's eyes and wondered if he should tell him the truth. He knew his story would be difficult to believe, but Mr. Hornby seemed to be willing to listen and so kind. Matt longed to tell someone all that had happened. He took a deep breath and began. I'm not from Pennsylvania. I'm from America, but not your America, Matt said. Oh, I see. You're from the territories, are you? Mr. Hornby asked. Well, yes, I guess Nebraska would be considered the territories, but, well, this is going to sound strange. Matt shot a look at Mrs. Hornby, who was watching him out of the corner of her eye. I'm from the 20th century, he said, looking back to Mr. Hornby. Matt paused, watching the old man's face for a sign of surprise, but Mr. Hornby sat blankly staring. My hearing's a faulting me, lad. What is it you said? He asked, moving closer. The 20th century. I'm from another time, from 20th century America, Matt told him. He explained all about the club and the camp out and the rowboat, and as Mr. Hornby sat quietly listening, Matt began to hope that he'd believed his story and that maybe he could even help him find his way back home. Matt watched the old man looking over his wife, who now sat at the edge of her stool with her face gone completely sour. Then Mr. Hornby looked back at Matt and softly said, "That's all very interesting, Matthew, but tell me, son, did you receive any wound to your head of late?" Matt's face fell. "You don't believe me, do you?" There, there, Matthew." Mr. Hornby reached out and patted Matt's shoulder. "Temperance, I don't think we can let this boy off on his own. He's been affected, that's plain." The old man looked over, pleading to his wife. "Just so," Mrs. Hornby said, standing, "but he's more of a danger to us now than ever. If he's questioned in our house, there's no relying that he'll answer. We could lose everything, including our necks. No, he's just got to get dressed and leave at once," she said empathetically. Mr. Hornby lowered his eyes. "At once, Nathan, do you hear me? At once," she snapped, glaring at her husband as she marched out of the room. "Ah, she's a kind woman, really. Just frightened, she is," Mr. Hornby sighed. Matt wondered just which of them he was trying to convince. It wasn't long before Matt had put his clothes back on. They felt warm and toasty after hanging in front of the fire. Mr. Hornby wouldn't let him out of his door without giving him a deerskin coat that the old man claimed he had gotten too heavy for. "Come along then, and we'll saddle up Blackjack," Mr. Hornby said, reaching for his hat. "Blackjack?" Matt asked, following him outside to the barn. "A mule," Mr. Hornby replied. "He'll follow the trail through the woods and take you right to the river. He's smarter than any horse you've ever been on, I'll wager." Matt watched uneasily as the long-eared, sleepy-looking Blackjack was led from the barn. Matt wanted to tell the old man that he had never been on a horse before, much less a mule. "A skateboard, Mr. Hornby. That's the last thing I rode," Matt was thinking as he watched Blackjack open his mouth into a big-toothed yawn. "You can take care of your business yonder, son." Mr. Hornby took him, nodding toward a little shed behind the house. "My business?" Matt asked with a blank look. The old man shook his head and sighed heavily. "Surely that head wound has left you confused," he said, gently leading Matt to the shed. "Come along now," and he opened the door and gave Matt a little push inside. "Oh, that business," Matt smiled on discovering that the shed was an outhouse, because back then they had the bathroom in a different house. As he sat on the crude wooden seat, Matt thought of his bathroom at home with its fancy marble sink and cushioned toilet seat. He looked down at the hard frozen ground and thought of his bathroom's plush pink wall-to-wall carpet. He sighed, thinking of the jacuzzi that his father had just installed. "I never thought I'd admit it, but a bathtub sure would sound good about now," he thought, "and a roll of toilet paper would look even better." Meanwhile, Mr. Hornby was having a conversation with Blackjack. "You're to take him to the river, then," the old man whispered to the mule, "and I trust you'll keep on the trail. The lad's a bit daft, you see, so it'll be up to you, old boy, to look after it." Matt found the two waiting out the road in the front of the house. He looked warily at the mule and took a step forward. "You've nothing to fear," Mr. Hornby smiled on seeing Matt's worried look. You'll not find a smarter animal," he assured him as he helped Matt climb up on the mule. "Now, the first house you come to is just before the river road. It's my cousin's farm, and you'll leave him there. Blackjack will know enough to be waiting for me, and I can come pick him up. You'll have to manage as best you can finding passage across the river. If all goes well this morning, you should be able to return as you came, though in truth, it's a miracle you crossed at all with the river being as it is." The old man frowned. "I'm sorry that I can't take you as far as the river myself, but my Temperance is sick with worry about the troops being so close, and I dare not leave her again." "Oh, and that's all right," Matt said as bravely as he could from atop the mule. The day was overcast when Matt looked towards the woods. He could see the threatening storm clouds gathering above the tree line. Just then the door of the house opened from Temperance Hornby came flying out. Matt felt himself stiffening as he expected some shrill send-off from this old woman. She said nothing, though, as she walked up to Blackjack, offered him a handful of crumbs, and then she brought out another hand from behind her back, and Matt could see that she was holding a pair of shoes. "It's not the season to be without shoes," she said, quietly handing Matt a pair of wool socks and old shoes. She quickly turned, and without another word, hurried back into the house. Thank you, ma'am, Matt mumbled, embarrassed by her sudden gesture of kindness. Mr. Hornby came up beside him with his eyes twinkling. Didn't I tell you she has a soft heart? He whispered, untying Matt's sneaker and helping him to unravel the linen rags that had been wrapped around his other foot. The shoes were a little big, but the socks were so heavy that they took up the extra space. They'll be fine, thanks, Matt smiled, looking down at the old buckled shoes. And then he remembered Israel's beads. Mr. Hornby, do you think you can do me one more favor? Matt asked, reaching into his sweatshirt pocket. Oh no, he suddenly cried on finding the pocket empty. Here now, what is it, son? The old man asked. The beads, they're gone. My friend's beads, they were in my pocket in a leather bag last night. I have to give them to his sister. I promised Israel I would, Matt cried. Let me have a look in the house, Mr. Hornby suggested. They may have dropped out of your pocket when we hung them up, your clothes up to dry. He went into the house to search for the beads, only to come out empty-handed a few minutes later. I'm afraid they're not there, Matthew, he said, shaking his head. They must have fallen out of your pocket before you arrived. Matt felt profound sadness at having to break his promise to Israel. Unable to hide his disappointment, he thanked Mr. Hornby for looking and for all of his help and kindness. I only wish I could have done more, Mr. Hornby sighed. Don't you think too badly of us, Matthew, he said, holding Matt's sneaker to his chest. And God be with you. And then he gave the mule a slap in the rump, and the animal headed slowly for the woods. Matt turned around several times to wave goodbye. He was glad that Mr. Hornby had not gone back into the house. It was the same feeling he had when he was in kindergarten, and he wanted his mother to stand in front of the house waving until the bus pulled away. Only now, instead of the bus, he was riding away on a mule. He turned around for one last look at the safety of the Hornby farm, and he could just make out the old man standing in his doorway, waving with one hand while he was holding the red sneaker in the other. Matt took a deep breath as he and Blackjack entered the woods. The powerful aroma of thyme was everywhere. Matt had never smelled anything so fresh and beautiful. So this is what America was like 200 years ago, he thought, riding past the magnificent evergreens. He felt as if he had entered a fairyland of trees iced with frost. Everything seemed so alive and unspoiled. There weren't any highways or with cars and trucks rushing by, no planes overhead, no fast food restaurants or shopping centers. It seemed so strange and different, this America, and yet he thought about the people he had met and realized they weren't that different from the people of his own time. He thought of Mrs. Hornby and how she reminded him of Mrs. Pritchett, his second grade teacher. So much so that Matt wondered if she wasn't Mrs. Pritchett's ancestor. Mr. Hornby was not unlike Matt's grandfather. Why, even Henry Shooter, now that he thought about it, reminded Matt of the bus guard at his school bus. And Israel. Who was Israel like, Matt wondered. He felt the tears coming to his eyes as he thought about his friend. Israel was special, Matt decided, like no one else. He was the older brother Matt had always dreamed of having. Riding along, thinking of Israel, Matt sadly thought about the beads and his broken promise. He rode along for a while, unable to think of anything else. Matt felt ashamed that he had let his friend down. He felt so sad and lonely that he began to talk to Blackjack. Matt told him all about Israel and how what they'd been through together. He even told Blackjack about his secret wish to have an older brother, someone just like Israel. Blackjack was very quiet as Matt talked, and every now and then he would turn his head just so as to not miss any of Matt's conversation. Blackjack was a very good listener. They were so busy with their discussion that Matt hadn't noticed how far into the woods Blackjack had taken him, and suddenly a strange noise made the mule jerk his head sharply to the left. Matt heard the noise again, only this time it seemed to be coming from the right. He felt a shiver run through him. It almost sounded like some kind of strange bird call. Did you hear that, Blackjack? Matt whispered nervously. Did that sound like a bird to you? But Blackjack didn't answer as he carefully made his way along the trail, taking them further and further into the darkness of the lush forest. Matt flinched at the sound of another call. Some strange bird in these woods, huh, Blackjack? He croaked. Maybe it was a rabbit. My friend Hooter had a rabbit once that got his foot caught in a lawnmower. Kind of sounded like that, but I guess you don't have any lawnmowers around here, do you? Matt whispered. Blackjack wasn't thinking about lawnmowers or rabbits or birds, though. Blackjack, as Mr. Hornby had said, was one smart mule, and he knew what Indians sounded like when he heard them. Ooh. Uh-oh, so Indians are on their tail, hiding in the trees. Good. Okay, chapter 16. It sure is creepy in here, Blackjack, Matt whispered as he and the old mule made their way further along the trail. The strange noises that they had been hearing were now following by the rustling of leaves. He turned around slowly and was looking behind him when the mule suddenly came to an abrupt stop. Matt quickly turned in his seat to find 2 Indians standing on the trail behind him. They were dressed in deerskin shirts and pants. Their long black hair fell down to their shoulders. One raised a tomahawk while the other held a bow with a long arrow pointed directly at Matt's heart. They didn't appear to be much older than Matt, but they didn't lessen their terror, for they were just children. These Indian boys displayed a fierceness and a courage that Matt had never seen in boys before. Looking into their unblinking dark eyes, he felt the commanding presence of their strength. Whew. Tense. It left him feeling weak and soft and frightened. Matt found himself doing what he always did when he was truly terrified. He closed his eyes and he'd never been able to watch a horror movie on TV all the way through without closing his eyes and asking Katie to tell him what was happening. There was no one to tell him what was happening now, so he just sat with his eyes shut tight, listening and waiting. Suddenly, he heard some leaves rustling and more footsteps. Matt tried to squeeze his eyes tighter. There's more of them, he thought frantically. Probably a whole tribe will never live to... And before he could even finish his thought, he heard someone speak. Oh my gosh, doesn't that look like the chief? Came a voice from the bushes. Matt cracked one eye open to see the 2 Indians standing before him, and then he opened the other to see Hooter looking out from behind the bushes. Hoot! Matt cried out loud. But on hearing this, the Indians thought he was giving some kind of war cry, and they rushed to the mule and pulled Matt off. No! Hooter yelled, jumped out from the bushes, and coming to Matt's aid. Friend, he's Friend, Hooter tried to explain. Hooter, I don't think I've ever been so glad to see anybody in my whole life, Matt exclaimed as the 2 boys embraced. You look awfully good to us, too, came another familiar voice from the bushes. Matt looked over to see Tony, and coming into the clearing, too. Tony! Matt shouted as Tony joined the embrace, and the 3 boys jumped up and down for joy, all trying to talk at once. Where are Katie and Q? Matt asked, looking back to the bushes. We've got some bad news, Matt, Tony began. Matt looked over to the 2 Indians. They had relaxed on seeing Matt meant no harm. While they waited for the boys to talk, they were busy picking berries from a bush along the trail. Matt turned back to Tony. Katie, is she hurt? He cried. No, she's okay, Tony told him. Well, kind of okay, Hooter added. What do you mean kind of okay? Matt asked anxiously. Why aren't you with her across the river? She's not hurt, Matt. Believe me, this is what happened. Tony tried to sound calm. We never made it across the river last night. First, Adam Hibbs fell into his gun. The bayonet stuck him right in the stomach. They said that he had never had a bayonet on his musket before. I guess most of the men hadn't, and they weren't used to using them. Because remember that bayonet is the knife on the end of a rifle. So I guess they weren't used to having those. Anyways, it was pretty bad. They don't have telephones to dial 911 or rescue squads to take you to the hospital when you get hurt, Hooter interrupted. So what happened next? Matt asked impatiently. Tony squirmed and continued to in a whisper. Well, then our boat hit this chunk of ice and started to go under, he said softly. Oh no, Matt gasped. It's okay, Matt, really, Hooter assured him. We were rescued by a flatboat that was crossing with some horses. They had to let the horses off so we could all fit on, though. That was horrible to watch those horses trying to swim, and then Adam Hibbs, he was bleeding so much. Hooter's voice trailed off, and Tony continued. Anyway, we came back to the shore with Adam Hibbs. They laid him next to the fire and told us to wait with him until they could get another boat to cross with. Hooter's eyes suddenly filled with tears. He was in a lot of pain, and they all thought he was hallucinating or something because he kept saying that he knew we were from another time. It was the same Adam Hibbs that was lost on the lake then, dude, Matt asked. No, Hooter said. It was his grandson. Adam explained to us that his grandfather had told him this fantastic story all about traveling through time in a rowboat. His grandfather told him to look out for the old rowboat if there was anyone in it, not to be surprised if they were dressed in strange clothing. I think he was really glad to see us and know that his grandfather was telling the truth. He was in pain, though. It was hard for him to talk, Tony added. It got so that he could only whisper, and so Q had to bend down to hear him. Most of the stuff about his grandfather, he whispered to Q. But where is Q? And where is Tony? Matt asked anxiously. I'm getting to that, Tony winced. This officer told us to stay with Adam Hibbs until he came back for us. He went off looking for the boat, and then Adam closed his eyes and he never opened them again. Sort of just sat there waiting by ourselves. And then maybe Katie saw it, Hooter interrupted. Katie saw what? Matt asked. The old rowboat, the one we came in, Tony explained. It was tied to a boat that had just come over from the other side of the river. The soldiers must have found it in the ice jam on their way across. We heard some officers talking about it, Hooter told him. They said the old rowboat was too small to carry many men across it, and that it should be saved in case we need it for later. They told 2 soldiers to drag the boat into some bushes to hide it. I remember that. You remember how you said Q was to be our brain? Tony interrupted. Well, he had this idea that we should find you and then all get back into the rowboat. He was sure from what Adam Hibbs told him that it could be done and get us back home. It sounded like a great plan, didn't it? He waited for Matt to agree. I don't know. I guess so, Matt said impatiently. Go on, what happened next? Well, I guess it wasn't such a good plan after all because things didn't work out the way we wanted. Tony hesitated. Will you just spill it out, Tony? Matt pleaded. Okay, Tony continued. Since no one was really watching us, it was easy to slip away from the shore. The soldiers were all so busy unloading the boats and forming into regiments, no one even missed us. We made our way into the woods just above the river. I scouted ahead for everyone. Yeah, about 3 inches ahead. Hooter smirked. Well, ahead, anyways. Tony shot Hooter a smirk back. I didn't think we should go too far into the woods and lose sight of the soldiers, he explained to Matt. Q's plan was to follow the soldiers from the woods and then catch up with you, but because of the storm, it was too hard to see what we were going, and before too long, we were lost. It was a nightmare, Matt, really, Hooter added. We were all so wet and cold, and then there was nothing around for as far as we could see but snow and trees. We were desperate to find some shelter. Matt knew from his own experience just how desperate they must have felt. Katie was beginning to cry, Tony continued. She wouldn't walk any further, so we found this big old hollow tree and put her in that. Q stayed with her while Hooter and I scouted around for some dry wood so we could use it to make a fire. We hadn't gone too far when we heard them. He stopped and looked over to Hooter. Who? Matt cried. Heard who? The enemy, Tony told him. I guess it was the British, but they weren't speaking English. At least it didn't sound like English. They had these fancy blue and white uniforms and a big black hat that stuck way up from their heads. It almost sounded like they were talking in German. Oh my gosh, Matt mumbled, the Hessians. See, Tony, I told you they weren't English, Hooter said. So what happened then? Matt wanted to know. Hooter and Tony looked down at the ground, too embarrassed to meet Matt's eyes. They carried Katie and Q off on their shoulders, Tony told him in a whisper. And you didn't try to stop them? Matt cried. Matt, they were huge. They had these swords, Tony tried to explain. We started to follow them, but it was so dark and we were so tired. We stopped to rest, and I guess we were falling asleep when we were woken by our friends over here, he said, pointing to the Indians. They saved our lives, Hooter added. They really know how to live in the woods. They made a fire and gave us something to eat. Hooter's voice suddenly lowered. What? What was it? Sorry, what is it? Matt looked to Hooter and Tony. Rabbit. Tony smiled. The Indians caught this little rabbit and roasted it over a fire. You know how Hoot gets about little animals. They kept telling him that this Big Mac was once a little calf. Tony smiled again, but Matt wasn't smiling. Did the Indians see the Hessians? He asked. I don't know. They don't speak much English, Tony told him. But the Hessians are on foot, right? Matt asked. They were pretty far into the woods to be able to travel on horses, Hooter said, and there weren't any around that we could see. Okay, then we know what we have to do, Matt said authoritatively. We do? Hooter and Tony replied. We have to find the Hessians and rescue Katie and Q, Matt told them. That's great, Matt. And just how do you suppose we do that? Tony asked. That's a good question, Tony. Now, if you only had Q here to give you a good answer, Hooter said, walking towards the Indians, who were crouched by a bush. We can figure this out with Q, Matt told them. I'm the president without Q. Matt told them, I'm the president of this club and I'll think of something. Don't worry. He turned to Blackjack, who had patiently waited for him on the trail. Coming up beside the mule, Matt whispered in his ear, You wouldn't have any ideas, would you, Blackjack? But Blackjack just blinked his eyes and yawned. Nah, I didn't think so, Matt mumbled. What a great chapter. So he's found his friends, and their plan is to rescue Katie and Q. So he found Tony and Hooter, and they're all trying to decide what to do. So answer the questions with text evidence. So make sure you go back and listen to it again so you can find those answers.